Welcome, my dear brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 35 today. We're going to be looking at the topic of a shifting landscape, the United States. We'll be looking at all of the things historically that impacted the United States in a major way, the different events, wars, etc., and how those things also impacted the church and the country as it developed through the years. So it's going to be another broad look, and it's also a very long one. So I'm going to go ahead right off the bat and say it's going to be 2. So we'll finish this out next week, but we'll get started today. And we'll start by looking at the very beginning, the War for Independence. The 13 British colonies in North America enjoyed a measure of autonomy. Political and religious circumstances in England made it difficult for the British government to exercise authority overseas. So because of the distance, because of factors about things that were going on in Britain culturally there, and also with the church, the British government couldn't exercise the control it initially wanted to. And so these colonies got set up with basically being able to rule themselves. And it's kind of like taking the toothpaste out of the tube, but you really can't put it back in. It's a very difficult process, but that's what Great Britain wanted to do. Because of this, many of the colonies organized their governments and trade in a way that benefited them rather than England, which makes sense. Without English control to make sure that didn't happen, they're going to obviously work things out for their own benefit. So once again, Great Britain's going to be looking later on and thinking we can do better than this. But in the second half of the 18th century, the British government began seeking more direct rule of the colonies. The colonies acted vigorously against the encroachment by royal authorities. This led to open conflict. Of course, nobody that knows anything about the history of this country or the world is going to be surprised to see these events take hold. What you might not realize, though, is that the people in the revolutionary time period were coming from a background of kind of already having established the ability to rule themselves, and it was trying to be taken away from them. So we look at these events and we think, well, okay, they just had enough of it, but that's not exactly the full picture. It was more of a sense that they had autonomy. They were able to largely rule themselves. That was getting threatened and taken away. And that's what ended up prompting the conflict. So a little bit different perspective than you may be coming from here. And it's an interesting take on this. 3 main factors contributed to the conflict. The first occurred when the British quartered 17 regiments in the colonies. The colonists viewed this as an instrument of repression. The British government would say, well, we're sending those troops over for your protection, possibly even citing the Indians. Well, at this point, the Indians weren't a problem. They weren't going to be coming in and attacking. There wasn't going to be a big issue with them. So the colonists weren't stupid. They realized what this was about. It was an occupying force that was coming in to make sure that British rule was going to be followed. And so they certainly did not like that one bit. Second, taxes remained a constant source of friction. And, we know what was said at the time, no taxation without representation, and that was true. It was a law in Britain that if you were going to be taxed, you had to be represented in the government. But for colonies, that didn't take place. That system wasn't going to work. And so again, these people came from that background. They didn't want to go with a system where everything was decided for them and they had no say in it. And we can understand that. Nobody would want to do that if they had the choice. Finally, there were conflicts over Indian lands. The British government decreed that there would be no more white occupation of areas beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This was unpopular in the colonies, and the reason it was unpopular is many of the people that came there and were actually sent there, it was for the purpose of going and gaining land, for moving outside the area and getting their own land. Something that they couldn't have done back home. And so they get there, pay the expense of getting there, or somebody pays the expense of sending them there. And then you arrive, and all of a sudden, well, wait a minute, you can't go do that. Well, that's not going to be a very popular move. That's a big deal. You can't then just get in the boat and go back home. many of these people, it took everything they had to get there in the first place. So again, we look back historically and we know that it was unfair the way that they took land. They didn't treat the native people very well. We know all that. But there are always circumstances on the other side too, and sometimes those are not going to be brought out just because the other point of view is going to be emphasized. So it needs to be said that they were put in a bad situation, and they are not going to want to go along with it. And so, these factors are going to add up eventually to what we know is coming. For these reasons, tension grew between the colonies and the British government. In 1770, British troops fired on a crowd in Boston, killing 5 people. So that was going to be a big thing that happened. Now we're getting fired on by our own government. In 1775, when British forces threatened to destroy an arsenal belonging to the colonial militia, the militia offered resistance, and the American War of Independence began. So we know that the war was on, and we know how that war ended up. On July 4th, 1776, delegates from each of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to proclaim their independence from Britain. So just a very broad sketch. We looked at some major factors. Of course, we know there's so much stuff going on behind the scenes, underlining reasons for things. And this isn't a U.S. history podcast, so we're not going to delve into those. But just to kind of refresh your memory on some of the big things that are going on, because the formation of the country is going to very largely impact the way that the church is viewed and the way that the church operates in this new nation. So it's good to go back and remember some of these things that we've learned and maybe forgotten about or just haven't had our memory refreshed. Finally, in 1782, an agreement was reached and confirmed a year later by the Treaty of Paris. So we've got a new nation now, and the church is going to be operating in this new nation. These events profoundly affected the church in North America. Obviously, the events of the nation are going to affect the church, and when you start thinking about creating a whole new nation, that's something that really hasn't been a factor in the church for a long, long time, probably since the breakup of the Roman Empire into what became new countries, but that even happened over a longer period of time. So it's kind of unprecedented events for the church. People viewed the new nation as proof of human progress. Part of this progress was leaving behind the dogmatic attitude of traditional Christianity and affirming only natural religion, or at best, essential Christianity. We know that people in the United States, especially those that were around for the formation of the nation, they had a whole different view on things. And they had moved away from the way things had been in the past. Many of them had come to the country or come to the colonies to get away from that in the first place, and the things that went along with it, both in religion and politics and socially, whatever you want to emphasize. So people here were already predisposed to having those attitudes, but the fact that they were able to actually create their own nation and to completely break themselves off from what had been their home country, that gave them a whole new boldness that what they were doing was right, and that they were the way going forward. And so it made them look at things a little bit differently, and it's going to make them look at the way church is done a little bit differently. And it's going to very strongly impact the way that the church develops in the United States, as we'll see going forward. The traditional teachings and practices of Christian churches were largely considered relics of a bygone age. So again, they're looking forward. This is the new thing. We're the new thing. Out with the old, in with the new. Such ideas led to 2 originally independent movements that were soon entwined: Unitarianism and Universalism. So these are 2 movements that still exist to this day. They started out as being 2 separate things, but they ended up uniting and really just becoming one. Unitarianism made headway mostly in Anglican and Congregationalist circles. Unitarianism rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, but also disagreed with orthodoxy on many other points. So these positions are really heretical. They may not necessarily be pointed out that way, but when you take the Trinity off the board, you're walking into heresy that was dealt with early on in the history of the church. And then there's all going to be other orthodox positions as well. So these positions are far away from traditional Orthodox Christianity. They haven't really been looked at the same way as other cult type groups have, because they haven't strayed to the extremes that those have, but they still have moved away from what the church had decided in many years ago was the correct teaching. They were rationalists, stressing human freedom and intellectual capabilities in contrast to the orthodox emphasis on divine mystery and human sin. So again, you're part of a nation that just created itself, and you're thinking pretty highly of yourself. You're thinking that as human beings, we've got things in pretty good shape here. Look at what we've done. We formed a nation in which people are free and they're able to act according to their own conscience. And yes, we have government, but government is not as restrictive as other places, and the people are governing themselves. So all these principles, all these ideas that the nation was built on, they all sounded really great, and they are really great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not in any way denigrating our country, but it can kind of make you think a little bit maybe more highly of yourself than you should. And it kind of led to some of this thinking that was around that, well, I don't need to hear about how, low down, dirty sinner I am. We're doing pretty good here. And, maybe we are okay. Maybe we ought to be emphasizing what we can accomplish, and not, what we need God for. So anyway, just brought about the very fact of the country being as it was and formed the way it was, the way people were thinking at the time, helped to bring about some of these new ideas in the religious world. This movement became influential among the merchant class in New England. We find that for these things. Of course, you look at this and you say, well, everything's happening in New England. Well, remember, there's not a whole lot else there is. There's a southern part of the 13 colonies that this wasn't going to be influential on. Of course, that's going to bear out as it moves on through and the country expands. But there's not a whole lot else that there is, really. There's the New England, and then there's the South, pretty much. So, it's taken a pretty big chunk of the country, but it is notable that it didn't come south. It stayed up in the New England area. Universalism, the doctrine that in the end all will be saved, was introduced in the colonies by Methodists shortly before the push for independence. Remember that one of the things that's notable about the Methodists is Wesley didn't like the doctrine of the Calvinist ideas of predestination and people being predetermined to either damnation or salvation. He liked freedom. He liked human freedom being emphasized over that, and the right to choose, or the ability to choose. And he certainly wouldn't have been one of these universalists, but you can see how, coming from the way he was thinking, putting such an emphasis on the possibility of all being saved, it's just one step further. It's a big step, don't get me wrong, but it's one step further to say, well, not only everybody can be saved, but everybody is saved or will be saved, and to push that. So so this is it's a going further, and it's going beyond what Methodist teaching is, but it's kind of a progression from where they start. These Methodists argued that the doctrine of eternal damnation was a denial of God's love. We still have those arguments to this day. People have a hard time understanding how a loving God could condemn people to eternal damnation without really realizing or making note of the fact that God he's not the one who does that. People choose to rebel against him and have had the choice all along. And it's your own sin that sends you there. In fact, God's work isn't sending people to damnation. God's work was to provide a way to escape that fate that we all are going to have to deal with. So, and he went to great lengths to do that by incarnating himself through Jesus Christ, one of the three persons of the Trinity. And to not only do that, but to live earthly life, to live a perfect sinless life, to be the right kind of sacrifice that could be made for our sin, and then to actually go ahead and be sacrificed willingly, and then to have the power to rise from the dead and overcome all this. So, you can look at it the way that some people do here, or even in our time now, that the loving God wouldn't send people to hell. But you can also look at it as the loving God loves so much that he sacrificed himself in order to keep people from having to go to damnation, to hell. And as the Methodists thought, if you did have a choice, then you pick that, you decide that, and God offers it, you decide to accept it or not. So, you can look at this more than one way, and sometimes you get bogged down on this. Well, God's sending everybody to hell. Well, you can argue that point, but the fact of the matter is God has provided the way to escape that. Let's move on. Some Universalist churches were organized in New England, but eventually they merged with Unitarians, so they eventually became one movement. It was in these circles that Transcendentalism found most of its adherents. The most famous adherent to this movement was Ralph Waldo Emerson. So we don't have a lot of time to talk about Transcendentalism, but it was associated with the Unitarian Universalist thinking. It combined rationalism and romanticism and held that there is a bit of the divine in all human beings. And it's important to note that because that's another thought that is prevalent in our day now. And it's in religious circles as well as just in human beings in general who are, some way thinking of themselves as spiritual. It's the idea that there's this spark of God in us. And we do know we're made in the image of God. And we're his creation. We are representations of that image, but we're not, God's not in it. There's not a divine part of myself. The only thing that it has anything to do with God is what he's done in my life, and the fact of the Spirit being in my life through the relationship I have with him through faith in Jesus Christ. So this idea that inherently as a human being, I have a piece of the divine in me is not correct. It's not biblical at all, but it comes out of this way of thinking. So just kind of a uniquely American, United States, new country approach to things have brought these ideas out. And so those are some of the new religious ideas. Let's look at the impact on some of the old religious groups. The most immediate challenge facing the churches in the new nation was the question of their relationship with Great Britain. This issue was most grave for Anglicanism. Obviously, that's the Church of England, so that's going to make a big difference. Many had looked at bishops as agents of the crown, so the naming of bishops for the colonies had been opposed even before the war. So they weren't these officials that would be in charge of what to do. They weren't in place. And even if they were in place, they would have probably left after the war or even before the war, but they weren't even there. Many members of the Church of England left following the war. They were loyalists, and when things didn't go their way, they got out of there. In 1783, those Anglicans who remained formed the Protestant Episcopal Church. So that's what the Anglican Church turned into here. At first, Methodism suffered for similar reasons. So we know Wesley was not a big fan of the colonies rebelling. Wesley called on colonial Methodists to obey the crown. He also criticized the colonists for claiming freedom for themselves while still holding slaves. He had a point there, but Methodists weren't going to be looked at very highly because their leader is sitting there saying, you can't go do what you're wanting to do. You can't rebel. You can't become your own country. So that's going to kind of put a damper on them for a bit. But after the Declaration of Independence, all English Methodist preachers in the colonies, except Asbury, we talked about him a couple of weeks ago, returned to Great Britain. So now these loyalist preachers, they got out. But the Methodist Church didn't fold. But thanks to the efforts of Asbury, American Methodism began taking its distinct shape, and new preachers were recruited. So now these Methodist churches, they're not going to be as influenced by Wesley anymore, because it's not his preachers that are in place. It's going to be Americans and people that are citizens of this new nation that's been created. So that's going to change things very drastically within the American Methodist Church. And obviously those changes still exist to this day. Finally, in 1784, at the Christmas Conference, American Methodism was organized as a church apart from both Anglicanism and from British Methodism. So it became its own thing. It was also decided that American Methodism would be led by bishops. We got into that discussion again a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, about that particular title, so I'm not going to rehash that. You can go back and listen to it, but that was one of the things that they made a decision to do. So let's look at some other Protestant groups. The Baptist Church grew rapidly, particularly in Virginia and other southern colonies. From there, they moved into the new territories of Tennessee and Kentucky. So we know the Baptist Church is influential throughout the entire country, but the biggest part of it that's in existence today and still is very large and influential, is going to be focused on the South, but it's not just in the South. The Congregationalists made significant gains in membership only in the areas colonized from New England. So they're going to kind of be regional. They're not going to really move a whole lot from there. In general, all denominations spent their efforts in reorganizing themselves in view of the new situation and in repairing damage done by the war. So there's going to be they're going to have to figure this stuff out. This is unprecedented. The church hasn't gone through a time where a group of colonists rallied together to beat out the nation that colonized them and then created their own nation. And not only that, but in an area that was largely not occupied by anything other than scattered native groups. So it's ripe for the picking to expand. And of course, we know that's what happened. So it's just a new day. It's a new time. Nobody has a roadmap for this. So these denominations are going to have to figure it out. Some of them do very well, and some of them don't do so well. The word denomination indicates that the various churches are seen as denominations, that is, as different names given to Christians. So this is a little bit different way of thinking as well. Yes, the churches are different denominations, but the church in general is all of that combined. So it's a little bit different way of looking at things. This indicates that North American Protestants tended to think of the church as an invisible reality consisting of all true believers, so this would be like the universal church, and of the visible churches or denominations as voluntary organizations that believers create or join according to their convictions and preferences. So the church you attend is a group that people will go to different ones based on whether it is really in line with what they believe, and also just socially where they want to go, where their friends go. Maybe it's the only church in town, etc. But that's just a small part of what the church is. The church itself is actually all of those groups universally. It's every Christian everywhere, no matter what group they're a part of, denomination, however you want to say it. If you're a Christian, you're a part of the invisible worldwide church. And so this is a different way of looking at things than the way that it had been looked at as far as what church you belong to. So it made it very easy for people to get along well with people that went to different churches and not look at them as being like an enemy, somebody I have to go kill, etc. The things that have happened throughout the history of Christianity, unfortunately. They're fellow brothers and sisters. We don't go to the same church. We look at things a little bit differently, or maybe my particular church isn't even in your area, so you couldn't go there. But it doesn't matter because we're still part of the same family. So actually a better way of looking at things. It's still not great that everything's so fragmented and having the denominations, but at least there's the emphasis and the understanding that we're all brothers and sisters. We go to different churches. One practical consequence of the distinction between the church and the denomination is that the great debates that have divided North American Protestantism have not been confined to a particular church, but have cross-denominational boundaries. So this is interesting. Again, in the past, all Lutherans would agree on a position. All Reformed movement people might agree on a different position, and they would be in conflict with each other. Now, the way things are in the church, those conflicts don't necessarily, they're not just a one denomination deal. So not all Baptists think exactly the same way. Not all Methodists think exactly the same way. There might be some of these conflicts within even the exact same churches. There are people that think differently about an issue, and they may align more with people that are members of the Methodist church down the street than they even do with people in their own church. So a very different way of dealing with different religious issues that are going to come up, different conflicts, different doctrinal things. It's not going to be just us against them, one church against another, one denomination against another. It's individual people. And as Americans, people that are citizens of the United States, we are very much built on individualism. Yes, we've done great things collectively, but we so emphasize the rights of the individual that had to spill over into the church, and it has. And the emphasis both in Scripture And for a large majority of the history of Christianity was not on the individual, it was on the collective. Christianity is corporate. And in our country, with our emphasis on the individual, sometimes we lose some of that. And not to say that we don't have an individual relationship with God, we certainly do. But after all, the New Testament says that Christ died for his church. The Lord it works through his church. So again, it's uniquely American. It has something to do with the way that we think and the way that we were founded, that we're looking at this thing now more from an individual perspective than we are from the collective. And that's going to have a great impact on the way churches function. Therefore, questions such as slavery, evolution, fundamentalism, liberalism, and racial policies have simultaneously divided several denominations, and the partisans of one position or another have joined across denominational lines. So it isn't going to be just in one group necessarily anymore. Looking further at this, the disciples of Christ were born as a response to the denominationalism of American Christianity. So this is a group that said, we don't need to have denominations, let's be united. The founders of the movement, Thomas Campbell and his son Alexander, had no desire to found a new church or denomination. Well, Wesley didn't with Methodism either, and it ended up happening. It's going to happen here too. Their purpose was to call all Protestant Christians to unity through the proclamation of the gospel in its original purity. That's a great thing to do, but boy, there's a lot of things that have gone on since that was the emphasis, and you're going to have a tough climb to get that done, but you got to admire him for at least trying. Alexander Campbell combined some of the rationalism common to his age with a profound respect for the authority of the New Testament and his thinking. Much of his interpretation of the New Testament was influenced by rationalist views, so he's going to have a very unique perspective at looking at all of this. With the firm conviction that Christian unity could be achieved by a common return to primitive Christianity as he understood it, Campbell launched a program of reformation that eventually led to the formation of a new denomination, the Christian Church, which is exactly the opposite of what he wanted to do. So this is the Disciples of Christ, or the Christian Church. It's a group that was founded as a reaction against denominationalism that became its own denomination. So that's ironic, but also kind of predictable. Given the tensions in Campbell's own vision, as well as in various latter influences, throughout their history, the disciples have included both a rationalist and a conservative wing, and in a lot of ways, most of the denominations have done that as well. But all have been characterized by their interest in Christian unity. So a desire for Christian unity launches a movement that then divides itself out. And, it's just the way things go. It's human nature. It's the way of things. And it was inevitable, but you admire the sentiment. It would be nice for us all to be unified, and we will be one day, but probably not on this side of eternity. Moving away from just the formation of the country in general, there's another big factor that's going to come into play in the religious scene, and that is immigration. As people come into the country, they're going to bring their religious ideas and culture with them, and that's going to impact things. Late in the 18th century and throughout the 19th, there were unprecedented waves of migration from Europe to the United States. And still today, people are wanting to come here. It's amazing to me. We hear about how awful we are as a country, and yet everybody in the world wants to come. I'm saying that in hyperbole. I know not everybody wants to come, but it's still true that the United States is very appealing to people, and they still would like to get here. There are people that are, there's a lot of debate in this country about whether immigrants should be let in under what conditions. Not that anybody says there shouldn't be any, but what are the conditions? Should it just be an open door policy, or should it be standard, whatever? So, as bad as we might be, and trust me, there's a lot of bad you can talk about, it's still a pretty good thing going, and people are wanting to come here, and certainly at this time period, throngs of people came. This was due partly to conditions in Europe and partly to the vast expanse of land available in the west of the new nation. Those vast expanses of land weren't available in Europe. Land had pretty much been used up. You didn't have those opportunities. You did here. And people came as a result of that. And then things in Europe weren't also great either. And they just thought of it as being a new start, a fresh start, and wanted to get that. At the same time, the slave traffic also unwillingly brought vast numbers of people to the United States. So while immigration's happening, the slave trade is happening, and they're just bringing people in left and right, and not thinking that eventually, these people are not going to be slaves anymore, and you've just brought in a huge population of a group that came in, but they didn't come in because they wanted to come, enjoy a new nation. They got forced in, and there are going to be some chickens come home to roost about that. Trust me, we all know that's coming. The massive immigration had far-reaching consequences for the shape of Christianity in the United States. Naturally, it would. Many of these immigrants were Catholic. That's going to be one of the biggest ones. By the middle of the 19th century, the Catholic Church had become the largest religious body in the nation. At the time of the Revolutionary War, it was a small minority. That's a huge shift. And remember, even early on when we talked about the colonies forming, there was very little Catholic influence at all. And what was here, what came in, was not going to have very much influence. And it wasn't very attractive for them to come, honestly. But that changed as these immigrants came in. They came from Catholic areas, and they brought their religion with them. And all of a sudden, things are going to shift in a big way. And the Catholic Church is going to have a way bigger impact because it's going to become the biggest group. Now, you may be thinking, well, that's, they're probably thrilled about that. Well, yes and no. It's going to cause some problems too. Ireland suffered a great famine around 1846 that lasted for several decades. Soon, Irish immigrants and their descendants made up the largest group of American Catholics. So definitely a very Catholic nation is going to come in with a lot of people, and that's going to tip the scales towards the Catholic side. This migration of Catholic immigrants created tension within the Catholic Church. At the parish level, each group of immigrants saw the church as a means to preserve its culture and tradition. Therefore, each wanted a separate parish. So it's going to cause internal struggles in the Catholic Church how to deal with this. On the national level, there were power struggles between various groups, each wishing to be governed by a hierarchy that understood and represented it. These tensions continued well into the 20th century. So basically, the religious issues are going to be tied much more to particular groups based on where they came from. So not just Catholics, but German Catholics or Irish Catholics or Italian Catholics. They're all going to want to say that's unique to their culture, not just the Catholic Church in general. And there's a bunch of them, and they're going to be pulling in every different direction. So the Catholic Church is going to have some headaches dealing with it and then trying to figure out how to make all that work. The growth of Catholicism provoked a strong reaction among some Protestants. In the very early years of the new nation, there was already opposition to unlimited Catholic immigration. They didn't want it to happen. They saw that as an issue. Well, wait a minute. What if all of a sudden, we move from this extremely highly represented Protestant group to now the Catholic group comes in and they gain power? Or, Lord forbid, they become the biggest group, which is what happened. So there were people thinking about it, and they didn't want it to happen, but it did. Later, the Ku Klux Klan targeted Catholics along with blacks and Jews. Then in 1864, Pope Pius IX condemned a list of 80 errors, which included several of the fundamental theses of American democracy. So this Pope comes out and basically trashes a bunch of the foundational elements that created our nation. And it don't make people love the Catholic Church anymore. This prompted a great mistrust of the Catholic Church among many in the United States. It would take another century for the nation to be willing to trust its highest political offices to Roman Catholics. So as Catholicism comes in and gains ground among Protestants, there's a reluctance to this. And that's going to hold on for a long, long, long time. And as you see, there's a lot of reasons why that happens. So immigration is going to make a great impact, if for no other reason that it creates a Catholic Church that goes from being a small minority to now being the majority. Let's look at more about how immigration affected churches in the United States. Lutheranism also grew rapidly as the result of immigration, primarily from Germany and Scandinavia. For a long time, the goal of American Lutheranism was the eventual union of the various Lutheran bodies in America. And the reason for that is the different Lutheran groups, from depending on what country they came from, when they got over here, they were fragmented. So they were trying to bring them all back together, and that was going to be an issue for a while. Other religious groups that grew through immigration were the Mennonites, Moravians, Greek and Russian Orthodox, and the Jews. Many immigrants also brought with them the ideal of life and religious community governed by gospel principles and distinct or even withdrawn from the rest of society. So these are going to be communal groups. They're going to stay together around their cultural, but focusing on the religious aspect and try to get away from everybody else to some extent. Some would still have interaction, but some tried to completely eliminate being around people outside of their group. The Moravians founded settlements in Pennsylvania that still exist today. Similar experiments in communal living took place among the Mennonites and Anabaptists. German pietists founded the community of Ephrata in Pennsylvania. In 1846, the Oneida community went so far as to practice complex matrimony, an arrangement in which all adults were married to all others of the opposite sex. So that's interesting. One of the most remarkable of these communities was that of the Shakers, led by Anne Lee Stanley. They immigrated to America due to social pressure they felt in England. So this group of Shakers were native to England. Like a lot of other groups, they felt pressure there. They came to America to get a fresh start. Mother Anne Lee claimed that she was the second coming of Christ who had now appeared in feminine form. Eventually, all would be saved, and the present community of belief was only the beachhead of that final salvation. So basically, Mother Ann is saying Jesus appeared the first time, he was masculine, now he's going to come back as feminine, and that's me. But she did teach that everybody would eventually come in. They were kind of the beginning group, but eventually everybody was going to join them. Meanwhile, believers must abstain from sex, which is the root of all evil. For a few decades, the movement flourished and several Shaker communities were founded, but eventually the movement dwindled due to a lack of new converts and the impossibility of new generations. Today, there are only a few surviving members. So if you want to go ahead and start a group that you want that will be destined to failure, that's not going to continue, then tell them they have to practice total abstinence from sex. It's going to do two things. First, you're going to have a hard time finding converts. There are not going to be people coming out of the woodwork wanting to join that crowd. But not only that, so you can't bring new people in, or it's going to be hard to. That's the only way you could grow, because you're not going to be creating new generations. There's not going to be more children coming in. The generations stop as soon as that comes into play. So, that group was never going to survive. And it's very limited. And the book I'm primarily basing this study on is a few years old, so I don't even know how many of these Shaker people are still around now. There may be some, but it's not very many, and there is no hope that there's going to be more. Now we're going to finish out this presentation today with looking at the Second Great Awakening. Toward the end of the 18th century, a Second Great Awakening began in New England. At first, it did not include emotional outbursts, but was characterized by a sudden earnestness in Christian devotion and living. And the reason that it didn't start out that way is the group that it started with. Attendance and worship drastically increased, and many spoke of having had an experience of conversion. Unlike other similar movements, this awakening made headway among some of the most distinguished theologians of New England. So this was more of a Great Awakening that began with the intellectual group and the theologians, the educated group. These were not people that were prone to emotional outbursts. They weren't going to probably necessarily have them no matter what happened. And so the movement was very different when it began. The First Great Awakening was you had a little bit more of that early on. But this is going to eventually end up being the same way. One of its foremost advocates was Timothy Dwight, who was president of Yale University and a grandson of Jonathan Edwards. So this guy is about as distinguished as it gets. He from the direct line of Jonathan Edwards and also the president of Yale, and he's a big-time advocate of this movement. The first phase of the awakening resulted in the founding of several societies whose purpose was to make the gospel known. Most important among these were the American Bible Society, which was founded in 1816, and the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, founded in 1810. And these two groups are going to have a lot of play in what's going to happen going forward in some pretty major events. When Adoniram Judson, one of the first missionaries sent by the American Board, became a Baptist, many Baptists in the United States joined together to organize a general convention, the purpose of which was to support Baptist missionaries. And so that's going to be a big deal in the Baptist church, the Baptist world, this joining together You got churches that are autonomous, but they're joined together in a joint purpose, and a big part of that, and you see it here is what it begins, is to support mission work. So this is kind of the foundation, or at least stokes the fire a little bit of what's going to be coming for the Baptist. Other societies born during the Second Awakening took up social causes such as the abolition of slavery and the war against alcohol. Women became leaders in the latter cause to the extent that in the second half of the century, the Women's Christian Temperance Union became the foremost defender of women's rights. Thus, some of the roots of American feminism can be traced to the Second Great Awakening. So this group that's against alcohol is largely women-based, and probably not a huge shock. In that time in the culture and the society that they lived in, men did a lot of the heavy drinking, and women faced the consequences of that. So they were not going to be for it, obviously. And turned out that group, because so many women were interested in banning alcohol and so many men were not, the group became led by women, and it naturally evolved into being a kind of a women's rights organization on top. So if you start looking at the background of feminism and the fight to give women equal rights, a lot of it started with this group, or at least they played a part in it, and it began as a result of the Second Great Awakening. It's interesting. Moving on, looking at this. Meanwhile, the awakening had moved beyond New England and the educated elite, and had made its way to people of less education and lesser means. So as it moves out of the area, going south and then west, it's going to move out of that intellectual circles into a different crowd. Many of these people were moving west. They carried with them the vibrant faith kindled by the Second Awakening. But since conditions on the frontier were different, the awakening now became more emotional and less intellectual, eventually becoming anti-intellectual. So it's going to go completely the opposite of what it started. The Cane Ridge Revival of 1801 in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, is an example of this shift. Originally announced as a camp meeting for the promotion of a deeper faith, and this was by a Presbyterian pastor, the event was a resounding success. And on the appointed date, thousands gathered. You have to realize that in this area and the culture they're in, they're looking for reasons to gather together. They're out on the frontier. They're kind of by themselves. Everybody's taking care of what they have to do. They're working hard. So just about any kind of gathering that's going to be attractive. And this is going to bring everybody in, and they're not all necessarily coming to be preached to. Many came for religious reasons, but others came to gamble or carouse. While some played and others drank, Baptist, Presbyterian, and Methodist pastors preached. So there's a crowd there that's here to hear the preaching, or they're there to hear the preaching. There's a crowd there that's there to play cards and gamble and drink and carry on, and the preaching's going on at the same time. So this must have been quite a scene. I would have loved to have seen this one. A critic of the awakening later declared that at Cane Ridge, as many souls were conceived as were saved. That's a funny thing. So I don't know if that's true, but somebody at the time that didn't like it came out with that. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. As many souls were conceived as were saved. So may well have been the case. However, the response to the call for repentance was surprising and overwhelming. While some wept or laughed uncontrollably, others trembled, ran about, or even barked. So you had people down on all fours barking like dogs. That's kind of a crazy scene. And that's where you start getting into just emotionalism that really doesn't have any point, and doesn't seem to be of any way from God. It's just kind of more of a mob mentality type of deal, or just being influenced by crowds. And you've gone to the extreme now. You're down barking. That's, again, I would have loved to have seen it. The meeting lasted a week, and since then, many were convinced that such gatherings were the best way to proclaim the gospel. So it's kind of the foundation, or at least a big influence behind doing like the week-long revivals that are going to be coming. And a lot of that's coming out of the Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening. But Presbyterians did not like the unbridled emotional response that was becoming part of the movement. Yeah, probably the intellectual crowd wasn't too crazy about going into a meeting, see a bunch of dogs barking, people barking. Soon, Presbyterians began taking action against ministers who participated in events such as Cane Ridge. So Presbyterians are out on this. But the Baptists and Methodists celebrated them. They're on board. This eventually developed into periodic revivals. This helped both Methodist and Baptist groups achieve rapid growth in the frontier. So as the nation goes west, the Baptists and Methodists are going to expand with them and kind of leave some of these other groups in the dust. Methodists and Baptists were also willing to use preachers with little or no education. The Methodists used lay preachers, many of them serving an entire area they called a circuit. The other groups wanted them to be trained, which they should have been. They're actually right about that. The ministers should have been trained, but when you're out on the frontier, there's no way to train them. So you're either training them and sending them out, that's tough, or you're probably not going to have them. What the Baptists and Methodists did was they just looked for people that said they were called, I feel called by God to preach. Okay, you're the preacher. And they put them in, and that allowed them to expand. It would have been better to have them educated, obviously, but it ended up being an advantage for them. Thus, both Methodists and Baptists were strongly represented in the new territories. By the middle of the century, they were the largest Protestant denominations in the country. So this is the first half of this. We're going to get into the second half next week. There's a lot more to come. And honestly, next week's is actually a little bit lengthier portion. I had to divide it somewhere, and it may even be longer. We'll see. But we'll finish out next week. Thanks again for taking time with me today. Hope you enjoyed this as we look at the progression of the church in the new nation, the United States, as it moves forward into our current day, which we'll get to and finish out next week. In the meantime, hope you have a great rest of your week, and God bless.